Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a topic a lot of you were really curious about: artificial DNA. We're going way past your basic biology class here, kind of into a world where we can not only read the code of life, but also rewrite it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating field.
It's like science fiction becoming reality, right?
It really is.
So, before we get into all that, I think it would be helpful to start with a fundamental understanding of what artificial DNA actually is. It's not just about tweaking our genes, is it?
No, no, not at all. We're talking about actually like building DNA from scratch in a lab, creating completely new sequences that don't exist in nature. It's about expanding the basic building blocks of life itself.
So you're talking about going beyond the A, T, C, and G base pairs we all learned about in school.
Exactly. And, remember, those base pairs are like the language of DNA. They pair up to form the rungs of the DNA ladder, and their sequence determines our genetic instructions. What scientists are doing now is adding entirely new letters to this alphabet.
New letters? Like,
So there was this team at Scripps, led by Floyd Rumsberg, and they created two new base pairs. They called them X and Y.
okay.
And they successfully incorporated these into a DNA structure, and they even got it to replicate within living cells.
So these new letters, X and Y, they can actually function alongside the existing genetic code.
It's really incredible.
That's incredible. What are the implications of this? Like, what can we actually do with this expanded genetic alphabet?
Well, I mean, the possibilities are pretty much endless, right? This breakthrough really opens the door to creating entirely new life forms, unlike anything found in nature. Imagine organisms with new functionalities, resistant to, all known diseases,
Mhm.
or even capable of surviving in really extreme environments.
Yeah. It's kind of mind-blowing to think about the potential, but I imagine it also raises some big questions, especially when it comes to safety and ethics, right?
Absolutely, and those are conversations that we definitely need to have.
Right.
But for now, let's maybe delve into some of the other groundbreaking applications of artificial DNA.
Mm-hmm.
One area I know you specifically wanted to explore was data storage.
Right. In my research, I came across a study where scientists in Japan used artificial DNA to store digital information. And that just seems wild to me. How does that even work?
It's amazing. DNA is incredibly dense.
Hmm.
It can store vast amounts of information in such a tiny space. I mean, think about it. All the instructions to build and maintain a human being are encoded in a single strand of DNA.
Yeah.
And scientists are now leveraging this incredible storage capacity to encode digital information.
So instead of hard drives or the cloud, we could be storing data within DNA. What are the advantages of that?
Well, several. DNA is incredibly stable, especially compared to our current data storage methods. It can last for thousands of years, making it ideal for archiving information. It's also incredibly compact. Imagine storing the entire Library of Congress in a space the size of a sugar cube. That's the potential of DNA data storage.
Wow. That's incredible. And you're saying this technology is already being used?
It's in the early stages, but researchers have successfully stored and retrieved digital information using artificial DNA. This technology could revolutionize fields like bioinformatics, where massive amounts of data need to be stored and analyzed. And think about the implications for your entire digital life, from photos and videos to documents and emails, could potentially be stored on a device the size of a grain of rice.
It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Right.
But let's move on to another area where artificial DNA is making waves medicine. From what I understand, this technology could be a game changer in how we treat diseases.
Absolutely. We're not just talking about treating symptoms. We're talking about potentially curing diseases at the genetic level.
Now, that's what I call targeted treatment. In my research for this episode, I came across something called CRISPR-Cas9. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, CRISPR is it's incredibly exciting. It's like a pair of molecular scissors that allows us to make incredibly precise edits to DNA sequences.
So we can actually go in and snip out like the bad parts of a gene and replace them with healthy sequences.
Precisely.
Wow.
And it's already being used in clinical trials
Really?
for diseases like cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia.
Wow.
Yeah, the potential here is enormous.
Yeah.
We could potentially cure genetic diseases that are currently considered incurable.
From what I understand, this CRISPR technology relies on artificial DNA to actually make those repairs, right? It's not just a cut and paste job. We're like inserting new genetic code into the body.
You're absolutely right. We can use artificial DNA to kind of provide the correct genetic instructions, essentially overriding the faulty genes that are causing the problem.
That's incredible. And you said this goes beyond just fixing what's broken.
Right.
Some researchers believe artificial DNA could be used to enhance our biology,
Hmm.
to make us stronger, smarter, or even live longer.
Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of talk about the potential of artificial DNA to augment human capabilities.
Yeah.
We could potentially enhance muscle growth, uh, boost cognitive function, or even slow down the aging process.
Okay, now we're getting into some really interesting territory. In your expert opinion, what's the most promising avenue for enhancing human biology with artificial DNA?
One area that I think is particularly fascinating is the development of xenonucleic acids.
Okay. Or XNA.
Hexanase, those are like completely synthetic versions of DNA, right?
Yeah,
I read that they're even more resilient than our natural DNA.
exactly. XNAs are designed to be more resistant to damage and degradation. And if we could successfully integrate XNAs with our own DNA, it could potentially lead to some really remarkable outcomes.
Like what could these super resilient XNAs do for us?
Well, for one, they can make us much more resistant to disease.
Right.
Imagine a world where our immune systems are equipped to fight off, even the most aggressive viruses and bacteria. That would be incredible. What about aging? Could XNAs help us live longer, healthier lives?
That's certainly a possibility. Aging is, in part, a result of damage and errors that accumulate in our DNA over time.
Yeah.
And XNAs, with their enhanced resilience,
Well,
could potentially slow down this process.
so we're talking about potentially extending our lifespan, maybe even dramatically.
Yeah,
That's a pretty heady concept.
it is.
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of questions about what it means to be human.
Right, right.
But there's another area of research that you marked in your notes that I think you'll find particularly interesting.
Okay.
It's about aging.
Yes. The research on telomeres.
Yes.
If I remember correctly, those are like protective caps on our chromosomes that shorten as we age.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Telomeres play a crucial role in cell division and DNA replication.
Okay.
And every time a cell divides, the telomeres get a little bit shorter. And when they get too short, the cell can no longer divide and eventually dies.
So longer telomeres, longer life?
In theory, yes.
Oh, okay.
And this is where artificial DNA comes in. Researchers like Dr. David Sinclair at Harvard are exploring the use of gene therapy to actually lengthen telomeres.
I read that he's already had success with this in mice.
Right.
Could this really work in humans? Could we actually reverse aging by manipulating telomeres with artificial DNA?
It's still early days, but the research is incredibly promising. Dr. Sinclair's team has been able to reverse aging-related decline in mice by lengthening their telomeres.
Wow.
They've shown that it's possible to reset the clock, so to speak, at the cellular level.
That's incredible. So we're not just talking about slowing down aging, we're talking about potentially reversing it.
It's a real possibility. And not just reversing it, but potentially halting it altogether.
Right.
Imagine a future where we age gracefully, maintaining our health and vitality for much longer than we ever thought possible.
It's both exhilarating and a little bit overwhelming to consider the implications of all of this. It seems like artificial DNA isn't just a scientific breakthrough. It's like a doorway to a future that we can barely begin to imagine.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Artificial DNA is a game changer. It has the potential to reshape our world in profound ways,
Right.
from eradicating diseases
Yeah.
to extending human lifespan to redefining what it means to be human.
It's a lot to process. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a step back and revisit the idea of synthetic cells.
Okay.
This is where artificial DNA is used to create entirely new life forms, right?
Exactly. We've moved beyond simply modifying existing organisms. Now scientists are creating entirely new life forms from scratch using artificial DNA.
That sounds like something straight out of science fiction.
I know, right?
Are there any real-world examples of this?
There are. In 2010, a team led by Craig Venter created the first synthetic cell.
Okay.
They constructed an entirely synthetic genome from scratch
Right.
and inserted it into a bacterial cell.
Okay.
Amazingly, the cell booted up and began replicating, following the instructions encoded in the artificial DNA.
So they created a completely new form of life in the lab. That's incredible and a little bit unsettling, don't you think?
It's a monumental scientific achievement, no doubt.
Yeah.
It opens up incredible possibilities, but it also raises a lot of ethical questions.
Right, because
Yeah.
now we're talking about potentially creating life forms that have never existed before. What are the implications of that? Where do we draw the line?
Right. Those are questions that scientists and ethicists and policymakers need to grapple with, right?
Right.
The potential benefits are vast, but so are the risks.
It sounds like we've entered uncharted territory with artificial DNA. It's exciting, but it also comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility. It really feels like we're kind of on the cusp of a new era, one where the line between science fiction and reality is becoming increasingly blurred.
I agree. It's an exciting time to be alive, but it's also a time for, you know, careful consideration. We have a responsibility to use this technology wisely for the betterment of humanity and the planet.
You mentioned ethical considerations, and I have to admit that's something I keep coming back to. We've talked about the potential benefits of artificial DNA, but what about the potential downsides? What are some of the risks we need to be aware of?
Well, I think one major concern is, the potential for unintended consequences.
Mm.
When we start manipulating something as fundamental as DNA, there's always the risk of unforeseen outcomes.
Right.
We could inadvertently create new diseases or disrupt ecosystems in ways we can't even imagine.
That's a sobering thought. And what about access to this technology? Will it be available to everyone, or will it only be accessible to, the wealthy and privileged?
Yeah, that's a critical question. We need to ensure that the benefits of artificial DNA are shared equitably
Mm.
and that it doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities. Imagine a world where, the wealthy can essentially design their children with enhanced abilities while others are left behind. That's a future we want to avoid.
Absolutely. It sounds like we need to have some serious conversations about regulation and ethical guidelines before this technology advances too far.
I completely agree. We need to establish clear boundaries and ensure that artificial DNA is used responsibly and ethically.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the basics of artificial DNA to its potential to revolutionize medicine, redefine humanity, and even reshape our world. It's a lot to process, and it seems like every answer leads to more questions.
It certainly does, but that's the nature of scientific exploration, isn't it? We're constantly pushing the boundaries of knowledge and grappling with new and complex questions.
You've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. As we wrap up, is there one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think artificial DNA has the potential to solve some of humanity's greatest challenges, but it also presents us with, really profound ethical questions. It's up to all of us to engage in these conversations and ensure that this technology is used for good.
Well said. This has been a truly eye-opening exploration of artificial DNA, a field that's sure to continue shaping our future in extraordinary ways. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring.